1896. Filmmaker Georges Méliès shows audiences a film set in a Gothic mansion in which a bat seemingly transforms into a human being with a puff of smoke. 1897. The Lumiere brothers shoot a film in which a skeleton appears to move and dance before our very eyes. 1920. Audiences are shocked and terrified as Dr. Caligari hypnotizes his patient and makes him murder a woman in her sleep. 1931. Bela Lugosi looks upon his dinner guests and announces,
"I am Dracula."
1942. A woman hears footsteps and realizes she is being stalked by an unknown presence on her walk home, only to be shocked by a sudden, loud noise. 1955, 2 children are pursued through the night by a menacing preacher. 1960, a woman on the run gets more than she bargained for when checking into a motel and taking a shower. 1973, a young girl possessed by a demon levitates above her bed as 2 priests repeatedly chant,
"That the power of Christ compels you!"
1984, a girl is seemingly sliced open in her sleep by a man who has knives for fingers. 1998, a man watches in horror and dies of fright as a girl crawls out of his television set towards him. 2008, a teenage girl finally reaches martyrdom as she is flayed alive. 2017, a teenage boy sits in an armchair and is hypnotized by his in-laws as he disappears into the sunken place.
Sink.
Welcome to the Evolution of Horror, a brand new horror movie podcast. My name's Mike and I'm going to be your host. In this podcast, I aim to explore the history of the horror genre, not just to review horror movies, but to look at their origins, their influences, their legacies, and the place they left in movie history. Horror has shifted and changed and evolved so much over the years that it's impossible to tell where its boundaries lie. How do you define horror? Where did horror start? How did horror start? How does horror reflect the fears of its time? How do zombies, slashers, ghosts, werewolves, vampires actually reflect fears of communism, nuclear war, technology, sexuality, our own mortality? In this podcast, I'll be trying to answer these questions, and in each episode I'll be joined by a different host or guest or critic, and together we'll be reviewing specific horror movies, we'll be looking at the broader context in which they came from, and we'll be trying to unpick exactly why horror is one of the most reviled and yet one of the most commercially successful genres in all of cinema. Join me for the evolution of horror. Okay, welcome to episode 1. So, this week I'm joined by a very good friend of mine. He also happens to run a blog called Outside of a Dream, in which he talks about a lot of horror movies. And me and him actually first met whilst working on a daytime BBC quiz show together a few years ago. I won't say what the quiz show is. I'll just say that it was hosted by Alexander Armstrong and Richard Osman and involved trying to find obscure answers to things. Anyway, it is my great pleasure to welcome Rob Watts. Rob, hello.
Hello, Mike.
Hello, how are you?
I'm very well, thank you. Very excited to start talking horror.
I know, I can't wait. So we've got lots and lots of stuff to cover for this first episode, because basically this is going to be a kind of broad overview of the horror genre, I think, really. And we're going to ask some questions and discuss some areas that are pretty much impossible to discuss, but we're going to try and tackle it. Questions like, what is horror?
Wow.
Why do people like horror? And we're also going to feature this week as well an interview that I did with Kim Newman, who's kind of the master when it comes to...
He's pretty much a legend.
He is, yeah. And I think even he struggled with some of those questions, you know, like, what is a horror movie? I find that quite an interesting question in general, because a lot of people, and again we'll get into this later, but a lot of people might, you know, argue that some films, if they're too good, they're not horror films, or, you know, whatever.
Well, there's so much criteria around what a horror film could be.
Yeah.
It's just impossible to narrow it down.
Yeah, exactly. But to give you a little broad overview of what this podcast is going to be, basically we're aiming to delve into the history of horror by focusing on different horror strands or subgenres, if you like. So, for example, we might spend 10 weeks looking at the evolution of the vampire film, and week by week we will review a different vampire film as early as, you know, Nosferatu, all the way through to something as recent as A Girl Walks Home Alone at Night, for example. You know, and then then after that 10-week chunk, we'll then move on to a new one, and we'll look at the evolution of the zombie movie, and we'll start from the beginning and work our way through week by week. So the podcast is going to be split into several kind of mini-series or strands, I suppose. So that's going to kick off from next week. So basically what we're going to be looking at from next week onwards is the slasher genre. So as of next week, we're going to be going from the very beginning across the next sort of 10 or 11 weeks all the way through to present day slasher movies. And as well as reviewing those movies, we're going to track the way in which the genre has changed and evolved. So that's essentially to give you a little idea of what we're going to be doing and how this podcast is going to be structured. Now, originally, me and you talked about doing a podcast on horror a long time ago. And I think it's difficult for somebody who's not me to be able to commit to something like this every week. So essentially, what's going to happen now instead is I'm going to be joined by somebody different every week. Sometimes it might be a friend or colleague. Sometimes it might be a critic. Sometimes it might be just a general horror fan. So that's how it's going to work. But this week, we're going to kick things off together.
Lovely.
Yeah. Now, before we get started, we would also love to be able to hear back from you guys. We are going to try and read back sort of listener feedback and emails, either every episode or if not at the end of each kind of strand every few weeks. We're going to have a big feedback section. So we really, really would love to hear from you guys. So you can find us on Twitter. Our Twitter account is @EvolutionPod. So you can tweet us anytime, or you can tweet me directly. I'm @TheMovieMike. Or you can email us if you fancy sending us an email at any time. We do love to hear from you. The email address is evolutionofhorror@gmail.com. So let's start off with this fundamental question. I mean, what got you into the horror genre? What was your kind of doorway into horror?
That's an interesting question. I think I was about 7 years old. Ooh. And I remember vividly for about 2 weeks I had nightmares after watching Beetlejuice.
Yes.
Now, Beetlejuice, I think is a PG or a 12? It's not an absolutely frightening film, but it deals with death pretty in your face.
Yeah.
It's got a pretty horrific looking main character, and that stuck with me. And I realised that actually I enjoyed the scares and the constant fear that I then felt for weeks afterwards. And then I took it from there, I suppose, seeking out whatever was supposed to be scary as much as I could, being 7 or 8 years old.
God, do you know what? Like, I feel like, and I don't know whether this is just when you get old, you think this, but kids' movies used to be so much darker in the 80s.
I've said that too. It's so true.
Is that just because we're old now, though? But I feel like you wouldn't get movies like Beetlejuice or Dark Crystal or Labyrinth these days, you know?
I don't think so, no. Yeah. I've got a younger sister, so in the sort of mid-noughties, I sort of took her to children's films, most of which were family fare, you know,
pretty
nice
mundane.
and light. But then there was Monster House, which I thought was pretty dark, pretty scary.
Yeah.
But since then, I'm not sure. Maybe the likes of Leica have made some of the more scary things, especially Paranorman, which was that Leica? I'm not sure.
I can't remember. There's the kind of Mexican Day of the Dead one. Is that Leica? I can't remember.
I don't know.
Well, kids' movies maybe aren't our strong subject to discuss. Oh, Coraline. That's Leica. Yeah. And that's a good one.
That kind of stuff is scary. But when you come to CGI animation, I can't really think of any.
No. I think kids can take horror to an extent. You know, obviously you wouldn't want to show them Martyrs or something, but you know, like kids, I think it's important to have that kind of dark scariness in kids' movies as well. I loved that as a child.
Children should know that there's like things that can scare them in the world.
Yeah.
You don't want to raise a child thinking that everything is hunky-dory.
Yeah.
And, you know, we grew up with Goosebumps, Are You Afraid of the Dark? All these things that were legitimately terrifying at tea time. You know? And that sort of prepared us for our future film going.
Absolutely, yeah. So after Beetlejuice, what was your first proper horror movie that you remember seeing, like adult horror movie?
I really don't know, actually.
No.
The first one at the cinema was the remake of The Haunting. With Owen Wilson and Tony Shalhoub.
Yeah, I think that was my first at the cinema as well. Because I remember it being a 12A horror movie.
Yeah, or 12 at the time.
Or a 12. Yeah. And I remember being very excited to actually... Because I think by that point I did already like horror. And I thought, oh, brilliant, I get to go and watch a proper horror film at the cinema. And it was quite terrible. And I think even as a 12-year-old, I remember thinking it was quite terrible.
Did you? See, I was pretty terrified.
Yeah.
A lot of the adrenaline came from the fact I very much needed the toilet. And for some reason, the group of people I was with were being very loud, and the usher told us we weren't allowed to leave to go to the loo.
What?
Because if we did, we couldn't come back.
What?
So I was on edge, as it was.
There's nothing worse. There's nothing worse than when you're sat in a cinema and you need to go to the toilet. That is, especially if you're mid-row. I have a thing now where I like to be on an aisle at all times for that kind of.
As long as it's a decent view of the screen.
Yeah. I think maybe growing up with older siblings, for me, I was probably exposed to a lot more than I should have been from a very early age.
Okay, like what? What was the first one for you then?
I think, funnily enough, Scream was my first horror movie.
Wow.
And, well, actually, no, I tell you what, I was into kind of dark stuff before that. One of my favourite things, I was obsessed with Michael Jackson as a kid.
Likewise.
And Michael Jackson's Thriller, I think, changed my life. I saw that about age 5, and I was obsessed with it. And I think my parents were really worried when I first accidentally saw it that I was going to have nightmares, but I loved it. And I had the VHS where it had the entire kind of 10 or 15 minute music video followed by like an hour-long making of doc.
Wow.
Where it kind of showed how they got him into all the werewolf makeup and the zombie stuff and the choreography. And I just watched it. And it wasn't even the music video itself, but I watched the making of on repeat just constantly. And I think that is responsible for a lot in my life, that VHS, because it was kind of the movie making process, the horror stuff, the music. I kind of loved everything that stemmed from that Michael Jackson.
Now you say that, I had History on VHS in the early 90s, and I remember vividly rewatching the opening sequence, which has nothing to do with him being a zombie. Really. But it's terrifying.
It's amazing. Yeah, it's amazing. And obviously it was directed by John Landis, who did American Werewolf in London. And so that was definitely my sort of way in. And then the first proper horror movie I saw was Scream. And again, my older sisters, I think, had rented it out on video. And I think they watched it after I went to bed. I really wanted to watch it. I remember seeing a little glimpse of it through the door, and thinking that I want to watch this. And then the next morning I woke up really early before everyone got up, and I put the VHS in and I watched it by myself at sort of 6 a.m. on video with the volume low.
How old were you at this
I
time?
was about 11, so not like super young.
Sure.
And I absolutely loved it. And I think also Scream is kind of a way in, a good doorway into horror, because they talk so much about other horror movies.
Sure, and there's places to go from there.
I remember thinking, what are these other movies they're mentioning? A Nightmare on Elm Street and Halloween and all this. So I think from that, I sort of then began to sort of start my horror education, I think. This is probably the most difficult question out of everything, but what is a horror movie?
That's a big question. And I don't know if I have an answer.
No.
I know that the types of horror that I like, the things that I would say are horror, scare me, make me uncomfortable.
Yes.
I know there's all sorts of debate around this, but I think it could be based in real life, could be supernatural. As long as it makes the adrenaline flow.
Yes.
That's a horror, really, for me.
Yeah, I would exactly agree with that. I think it just has to be scary. I think it has to be designed to be scary.
Sure.
Obviously, not all of them are, but I think like a comedy is there to make you laugh, a horror is there to make you scared or uncomfortable.
It's as simple as that.
I think it is, because I think it's impossible to peg it down to any other. Like narrative-wise, or it's kind of more about mood, isn't it, than on tone than anything else.
Sure, I mean, you can look at all sorts of tropes throughout the history of the genre, but ultimately, if it's not scary, how could it be a horror? Yeah,
exactly. Like, I think, as compared to other genres like sci-fi, where you'd know it's a sci-fi because it's in space, or it's to do with machinery, or a Western because it's visually a Western. I think with horror, that it doesn't have that. It is more about the tone, isn't it? Because you can have a horror set in space or in the Wild West or in whatever, and it's still a horror. Okay, well, I think the best person or the most equipped person to answer some of these questions would be someone who is more knowledgeable than us. So now we're going to have a little listen to my interview with the horror legend Kim Newman. We are very, very excited to welcome Kim Newman to the podcast. Kim, hello.
Hello.
So, just for people out there that might not know exactly what you do and what you're known for, I mean, you are generally thought of as sort of the go-to guy for all things sort of horror and genre movies. Is that fair to say?
That's reasonable. There are other genre cognoscenti or experts or whatever are available, and there are many people who are equally up on this kind of stuff. But I broadly, I cover a lot of things. I have a column in Empire magazine where I review films that don't get theatrical distribution. It's been running so long that it started out with like video rentals, and I've lived through 3 or 4 different media. Yeah, but it's still the same films. I mean, it's still, well, not the same films, but they feel like the same films. They're still making mutant shark movies and cabin in the wood movies and, yes. And slasher movies and zombie apocalypses. Yeah, that seems never to stop.
No.
And that is something that interests me. I quite like being the person who looks at the stuff that many other critics don't, and quite often it's just to find the really cool, interesting films that would slip through the cracks otherwise. But also, I have to say, there is a certain pleasure in being the person who's seen every single Sci-Fi Channel mutant shark movie and can tell the fine gradations of difference between the Sharknadoes and the Sharktopuses.
Sharknado, The Fourth Awakens. Premiere Sunday, July 31st on Sci-Fi.
I just want to go back to the beginning and sort of the origins of the horror genre, I suppose. Sure. I mean, how, to your knowledge, what is the kind of, where did horror start in terms of cinema? I mean, is it as old as cinema itself?
Oh, probably. I mean, the official histories usually start with Georges Méliès and those little trick films. I think they're more like magic acts than narrative films. It is like seeing the last trace of a 19th century art form. Then after that, there are all kinds of lost silent films, and there are things like, there are plenty of versions of Frankenstein or Jekyll and Hyde. Nosferatu is a good, or Caligari, a good places to start.
They always kind of seem like a 0.0 generally, don't they?
I think if you're talking about horror as a genre rather than a mood, it's probably the Universal films. I think all previous movies that we can retrospectively say were horror films felt like something different at the time. They felt like mysteries. I mean, on Broadway, Dracula was called a mystery play, and it followed The Cat and the Canary and a bunch of other things like that, which are old dark houses with fake ghosts in, Scooby-Doo endings. But Dracula has a non-Scooby-Doo ending where he actually is a vampire.
Dracula. The very mention of the name brings to mind things so evil, so fantastic, so degrading. You wonder if it isn't all a dream, a nightmare.
But I don't think it's until the sequels to Dracula and Frankenstein that somebody could go to a studio head and say, let's make a horror film. I think when Universal were greenlighting Dracula and then Frankenstein, they were looking to well-established literary properties that had also been Broadway plays that were kind of weird and macabre, but in the way that The Phantom of the Opera or The Hunchback of Notre Dame had been, which are sort of not quite horror films.
Yes.
Yeah, but they're you can see that they're the prehistory of the horror film. But once Dracula and Frankenstein were out and were hits, and if you look at it, that's like 1931. In 1932, every other studio in Hollywood puts, Paramount do Jekyll and Hyde and The Island of Lost Souls. MGM do Freaks.
We accept her, we accept her. Google gobble, Google gobble.
All the studios try and get their own horror films. Warner Brothers do Mystery of the Wax Museum and Dr. X. And what's interesting is they're all done in their own studio styles. And it's not until after that glut, and there must have been in that year 15-20 horror films from Hollywood and a few others like Carl Dreyer's Vampire from around the world.
Yeah.
And I think when you get after that, in 1933, you can say what a horror film is.
It's become a genre.
Yeah.
She's alive! Alive!
It may well be that the name horror film caught on because it was what people in Britain who wanted them banned called them.
Right, that's interesting.
It's why the British Board of Film Censors brought in the H certificate for horrific. And so it's almost like And this may be one of the reasons for the thing we're going to talk about later, the sort of cultural cringe about horror, is it's a genre that was named by its enemies. Yeah, it was called horror by people who wanted to suppress it.
That's interesting.
And I don't know, and over the years, people have tried to say, wouldn't terror be better, or gothic, or supernatural, ghost story, fantasy? I say, maybe. But that ship sailed.
I think that's the thing, and there are so many little categories. I mean, how would you describe horror? A horror
that's
movie,
a good point.
The horror genre.
I'm not entirely sure. It's what people like me say when they point to a horror film, and I actually think there's a lot of really interesting work being done in the fringes of horror. I'm really interested in that. So, but I love. Can we look at what's a mainstream horror film? I think Dracula is a good example. That's a good template for what a horror film is. And certainly when the Universal film was out, it was the template that other studios use. You hire Bela Lugosi.
Listen to them. Children of the night. What music they make.
White Zombie is the Bela Lugosi film made after Dracula. It was made on the sets of Dracula, so it looks like Dracula. Universal's The Mummy is kind of structurally exactly the same as Dracula. And when horror was kind of reinvented as a sort of mass market phenomenon in the 70s, Stephen King's Salem's Lot is explicitly Dracula. And so it's almost like Bram Stoker invented the horror film.
I am Dracula.
Robin Wood had this formula for horror, which is normality is threatened by the monster. And of course, as soon as you say that, you perversely start thinking of counterexamples like Invasion of the Body Snatchers or The Stepfather, where normality is the monster. But still, Wood's formula is pretty good for 90% of horror.
Because I suppose it's still a different normality to the one we know, isn't it?
That's right. We are invested in the normal characters, the life, and there is a monstrous threat. Sometimes from abroad, sometimes from the inside the family, or what. It's why Halloween is a great slasher movie. So many of its imitators don't understand it because it's not about Michael, it's about Laurie. The whole film is dependent on you falling in love with Jamie Lee Curtis.
Get in there, come on, Tommy. Now lock the door.
But not just her, but liking her friends, awful as they may be in some ways, you have to be invested in them to be frightened by the fact she's menaced by Michael. And Michael is a guy in a mask, right, who is unknowable and interesting only as a threat or as a blank, which is why there are all those speeches Donald Pleasance makes about there being nothing behind the eyes and all pure evil, all that. That's nonsense in psychological terms, right? But that's what makes it work as a horror film.
I met this 6-year-old child with this blank, pale, emotionless face and the blackest eyes, the devil's eyes.
If you look at, say, Rob Zombie's remake of Halloween's a perfect example. Rob Zombie loves Michael and doesn't give a shit about Laurie. And that's why the film is sort of interesting in parts, but it's never suspenseful and it's never scary. There's a sort of prejudice or a stereotype of the people who write horror as weird, depraved, strange. And in fact, guys like Rob Zombie, tattoos, stupid name, all that. He's lit, and actually, I think there are some interesting things to do with his films, but. He sort of incarnates your idea of horror creator as other, as somebody who's so identified with his monsters.
What's the matter, kid? Don't you like clowns? Why? Don't we make you laugh? Aren't we fucking funny? You best come up with an answer, because I'm going to come back here and check on you and your mama. If you ain't got a reason why you hate clowns,
I'm gonna kill your whole fucking family.
All right, now get your fucking ass out the car. Come on. Yeah.
I read a quote from, I believe it was Glenn Sparks, who said that the key to a successful horror film is relevance as well as tension and unrealism. I mean, would you say that that's true? Do you agree with that?
I think really successful horror films are the ones that surf the zeitgeist but also have a universal sense. Horror films quite often are, they're like Freudian analysis, where you sit on the couch, lie on the couch, and the shrink asks you, "So what are your dreams?"
Yes.
And you say, "Oh, I dreamt I was being chased through a jungle or whatever," and then it sort of decodes that what you're really worried about is and quite often you get that thing where you look at a 1950s horror movie, Invasion of the Body Snatchers or The Thing, and people say, "Oh, what you're really worried about is nuclear war or the communists or whatever."
They come from another world, spawned in the light years of space, unleashed to take over the bodies and souls of the people of our planet.
And right now, obviously, I'm seeing a run of horror films that relate to terrorism, but also a lot to the economy.
Yeah.
With the way the world is getting, and it's fair to say the world's been in terrible shape for 100 years, and probably forever. But horror's job is to kind of confront that in some ways.
This is not a test. This is your emergency broadcast system announcing the commencement of the annual purge sanctioned by the US government.
Going back to sort of the universal monsters, it felt like it was very much kind of you were scared, I suppose, by what you were seeing on screen. But then that started to change, didn't it? In the 1940s, you had movies by, people like Val Lewton, where it was more about what you don't see. It was more about sound design and shadows and the dark. And suddenly it opened doors to the possibility of, you don't have to see the monster to imply that there's a monster. Movies like Cat People, that sort of really changed the game, didn't it?
Across the centuries comes this exciting story of a modern girl cursed by an ancient legend. The legend of the Cat People. Women whose kiss means death, whose love turns them into vicious, snarling beasts of prey.
I mean, would you still consider those very much horror films?
Oh, absolutely, yeah. I think they may be the test case for that slightly snobbish attitude that's going around, that sometimes that, if a film is too good, it doesn't get counted as a horror film.
Yes.
And actually at the time, and it's one of those things that there were certain of critics who liked Val Lewton's films still. If you read the original, the 40s responses to his films, there is a certain undertone of regret that he's chosen such lurid subject matter, and I think because he was one of the first filmmakers who had a sense of his own the critical reception of his film, he felt that the fact he got good reviews gave him a certain power with the studio, which it may well have done. I mean, the fact that the films made money probably was more important. But if you look at his statements, he never goes around saying this isn't a horror film. He goes around criticizing, saying, sort of, I suppose, making fun of other studios' horror films.
Yeah.
But he makes fun because he thinks they're not scary.
Yeah.
And it's almost like what he's saying is, there's nothing wrong with making a horror film, but that doesn't mean it can't be good.
Don't you want me to walk you home?
No, thanks. I'm a big girl now, and I'm not afraid.
Oh, good night.
Good night.
I think he may be the first creator of horror to consistently give his characters jobs.
Right, yeah.
If you look at Dracula or Frankenstein, what are these people doing? Yes. What do they do the rest of the time? They occasionally have jobs that are relevant to the story.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And actually in the Warner Brothers films, people have jobs because that was the Warner Brothers style. Yeah, it's like when they made musicals, they were full of hard-boiled, desperate people trying to get jobs, right? Because they were the Depression studio. So their films are full of cops and wisecracking reporters and publicists and all this kind of stuff. Yeah, it's very show busy, but it's it's real as a world. But if you look at Cat People or The Seventh Victim or I Walk with a Zombie, everybody's doing something. Yeah. Besides the scary stuff that's in their life. Irena's a dress designer and Oliver's a naval architect. Yeah. And those things, they furnish the characters. The characters are played as if they had a bit more depth than the sort of stick figures you see in some other horror movies.
Yeah. What I saw the other night, I could hardly believe, Betsy. I thought I was looking at a woman who had compassion for me, who loved me. And yet you made that trip to the home fort to bring Jessica back to me. You, the nurse who's afraid of the dark.
It's the idea that before you can introduce the supernatural aspect, you have to, present a credible simulation of the world your audience lives in. There's it's a critical misapprehension that his films are about suggestion and not showing the monster and all. And this is something people say it about M.R. James as well.
Yeah.
There's a sort of refinement and a delicacy. Actually, Lewton's films are more violent than contemporary horror films.
Yeah.
More blood is spilled in his films than in The Wolfman.
Yeah.
The blood under the door in The Leopard Man is an unprecedentedly gruesome scene.
Yeah, it is.
For 1943.
Yeah.
Mamacita, let me in! Let me in! Let me in! If you love me, let me in!
Mamacita, let me in. Let me in now that I've spent half the night getting the cornmeal.
He's coming! He's coming closer! I can see it!
Just what she needs, someone to nip at her heels and hurry her up.
And other Lewton films, The Body Snatcher, they dwell on physical gruesomeness. But what they do is they do it well.
But I wanted to ask, actually, what you were just saying about, there are some films that, because they're good, people don't want to label them horror almost. I think Silence of the Lambs is an interesting one that I want to ask you about because, obviously that's a Best Picture winning, in my opinion, horror movie. It gets branded with the word thriller much more than horror.
But what it is it's stylistically a horror film, and that's an interesting thing. If you watch it back to back with Michael Mann's Manhunter, and they're basically the same plot. But Manhunter is a steely, high-tech thriller with some gothic elements, but it's very much in the world of forensics and the FBI. And in Manhunter, Hannibal Lecter is kept in a strip-lit white room, which is, my guess, what psychopaths are really kept in the asylum.
More realistic,
In Silence of the Lambs, he's kept in a dungeon, right? It looks like Castle Dracula. And the film is shot, lit, edited, and scored like a horror film.
Morning.
There Will Be Blood is a good one.
Ooh,
it's whatever genre that is, it's a sort of a western, isn't it? And then it's a kind of millionaire biopic, in the sort of Frank Capra way. But it's shot, lit, and scored like a horror film.
Some kind of ominous dread, isn't there?
Yeah, and that's because horror is a style. And it's quite interesting sometimes seeing horror films that aren't shot like that. Probably the first film that picks up on that is Psycho, which is shot like it's shot like a horror film and it's half not. The kind of the daytime half or the shower murder half isn't like a horror film at all. It's like a kind of rather sunstruck melodrama. But when you leave the motel and get into the Bates house, then it's a horror film. And Hitchcock is explicitly using the imagery of horror movies. There's a mummy in the basement. Literally a mummy. And Hitchcock, being British, knew that was a good pun. Just as I suspect he loved the Master Bates pun as well. And I think it's it's a bit of a futile argument, sort of then using the fact that horror is a style as well as a genre to invalidate or include works. Yeah, I'm ticked off by hearing people sort of trying to abstract good films from horror. Yeah, but I'm equally fed up with so-called horror fans going to films and saying this isn't proper horror because there aren't any guts on the floor. It's like I can sort of understand why people wouldn't want to be part of a genre that doesn't want them.
I mean, I can't believe the amount of people I recommended The Witch to last year. I just loved it. And so many people of my friends were so disappointed and said, what was that? That was barely even a horror film. There was nothing scary about it. And I thought it was terrifying.
And I think that it is. It's sort of terrifying spiritually as well as in jump scare terms. But another good example was Paranormal Activity, which some people thought was the scariest movie ever made, and some people thought it was just a twitching sheet. It's like, and I think that's a case that has as much to do with mood as temperament. And there you have this weird thing to do with the collective mood of cinema audiences. I saw Paranormal Activity at a late night screening on Halloween before the film was particularly well known, so before people knew what to expect or hype, and I've got to say it really played.
Something's here. I feel it breathing on me.
Yeah, people were terrified. People jumped and screamed at stuff that is just doors opening. And Yet, by the time it had opened, by the time people who went to see it, who had a bit more of a sense of what it was, or maybe saw it in the afternoon, or watched it, on DVD, fast-forwarding through the just wandering around bits, people just couldn't see it. They didn't see there was anything there. The Blair Witch Project had a very similar thing. People looked at it and didn't see a real film there because that's not what they were trained to expect. And it's like, it's not just what is a horror film, what is a film? What is a story? What is a narrative?
Here's the first motion picture to offer to the daring a look into the final, maddening space between life and death. The last house on the left. To avoid fainting, keep repeating. It's only a movie. Only a movie.
How far can you push horror before it almost becomes it no longer becomes fun, I suppose? If you take movies like, for instance, Cannibal Holocaust or a Serbian film, that end of the spectrum, and then you've got films like Texas Chainsaw Massacre, which kind of seem to straddle that line.
Well, it depends. A lot of that is to do with mood. I actually think that a Serbian film, I wouldn't call it fun, but it is funny. Like The Human Centipede. It's one of those films that people who haven't seen it but have had it described to them think is much more upsetting than it actually is.
Kind of notorious, isn't it?
Because I don't know if a Serbian film were made more in the style of Lars von Trier. Then I think it might be actually unbearable. And I'm trying to think. Although I've watched a lot of really tough confrontational stuff, the whole notion of I've watched a couple of those Faces of Death's films, which just don't particularly interest me. And I've seen one. I don't really need to see more. They're kind of boring and upsetting at the same time, which is not, to me, a fun way to. And there are plenty of things I've watched that aren't fun at all, but I would think are genuinely important. There are some really major important sort of grueling horror films that I think, well, I'm really glad I've seen that, but I never want to see it
Never again. Absolutely.
I felt that about Eraserhead the first time I've seen it, but I have gone back to that. And I think the thing about Eraserhead is that at least it's so amazingly made. I've seen raped in the basement type films that I never want to see again. But mostly because they're sort of shoddy, and I think that they're made by people who don't quite understand what the effect they are going for is. I thought I Spit on Your Grave was a terrible film when I saw it in the 80s. I've gone back to it a couple of times because people have found merit in it. I still, to me, it seems like amateur nonsense.
Isn't it? What about Last House on the Left?
Oh, I like that.
Yeah.
Not sure if I like it, but I do find that a film of merit.
Yeah.
And the same is true of other kind of extreme out there films that I actually have got a lot of good things to say about the Human Centipede films.
Yeah, well, absolutely.
Including 2 and 3, which I think they're really amazing.
Even 2.
Yeah, maybe 2 is the best of the series.
Well, it's certainly powerful because it evokes a real kind of grotesque, visceral reaction in audiences, doesn't it? That's the thing.
And it's like Sarlo. I don't necessarily want to see that again, but I'm glad I've seen it. But it does for me the real sort of go for the throat ruthlessness, something like Antichrist. You know, I will go back and watch that again because it's a beautiful film.
Yes,
as well as an almost unbearable movie experience.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I think that people who are working at that pitch deserve a certain support, but I don't think just automatically, raping children, will automatically, elevate your films to being classic status. And every year at Fright Fest, there's some awful piece of nonsense that people are going around defending as being transgressive.
What was it last year? There was a film, We Are the Flesh. Did you watch that one? Yeah. That felt like one of those types.
My friend Anton Bittel, who's a great admirer of that film,
yes.
will defend it. I'm less impressed with it.
Yeah.
Anton likes a certain degree of scuzziness that I find a bit beyond my general taste.
The Texas Chainsaw Massacre. After you stop screaming, you'll start talking about it.
And the Texas Chainsaw Massacre is one of those films that... it's either an extreme art film or an extreme exploitation movie. And your responses to it are like that. It's not a film that you're really going to have much fun with. No. I don't know if we've got a label for it, but it's. My first book was called Nightmare Movies, and I kind of feel that Texas Chainsaw Massacre is what I meant. And there's this thing that Night of the Living Dead has it, and The Evil Dead has it, and a few other things of taking place over one night in which something truly awful happens to a small group of characters, most of whom don't make it out alive or sane at the end. And that is its own little genre. Maybe it's the Cabin in the Woods genre.
It is. I think it's my favourite horror film of all time, Texas Chainsaw Massacre, because it's just from the second it starts, even with that kind of opening monologue, it feels like there's terror in every frame of that movie in a sort of way.
And again, that was a great cinematic experience. I mean, I don't want to be one of those people who goes on about how terrific it was in the 1970s. Because the Towering Inferno was a 70s film. There are plenty of rubbish films around. But because it was before sort of real hype, and Texas Chainsaw was banned in Britain, but it had a GLC certificate, and it could be shown in regional film theatres. I saw it in the Brighton Film Theatre, introduced by Alexander Walker, and it was like a special screening, and it was packed.
The film which you are about to see is an account of the tragedy which befell a group of 5 youths, in particular Sally Hardesty and her invalid brother Franklin.
People had heard of this title because one of the brilliant things about the Texas Chainsaw Massacre is what it's called. There's no messing around.
The title's terrifying.
It's not just called something vague. I believe one of the titles for it was Vortex.
Yes. Yeah. And one of them was Head Cheese, I think.
That's right. And it's like, I can see why you'd have done that.
Yeah.
But it's almost like when I know Samuel L. Jackson signed on to make that film Snakes on a Plane, and then at some point they wanted to change the title, and he said, I'm walking if you I'm making Snakes on a Plane. You can make Flight 13 or whatever. I'm making Snakes on a Plane. And Texas Chainsaw Massacre, in fact it's even better, it's the Texas Chainsaw Massacre.
The events of that day were to lead to the discovery of one of the most bizarre crimes in the annals of American history: the Texas Chainsaw Massacre.
I often think we take these things for granted, but it is one of the best titles of all time.
It is.
But at that time, just the idea that you would call your film that, was sort of, even before a single frame they had won.
Yeah.
You know, they had, and I think that was rather devalued by maybe the trauma approach of just the outrageous titles and trivial films.
Without the film, yeah. I think my favourite just outrageously stupid trauma movie title has got to be The Killer Condoms.
Something horrible is invading New York. Something terrifying. Something you've never seen before. It's the killer condoms, the rubber that rubs you out.
Another unbeatable title is I Was a Teenage Werewolf.
Yeah.
Again, parodied and now, but the thing is that thing is 60 years old now, and people are still doing I Was a Teenage joke.
Yes.
Halloween is another one, even Friday the 13th. Both of those had been used as titles before, but not for horror films, I think. And with Halloween, I suppose that was influenced by Jaws as a title. It was essentially you have a good logo. Psycho even has that. Where the font or the design that was used on the paperback cover ended up on the poster with the torn paper. They are more than horror films because they're pop culture monoliths.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
They are inscribed, and very few horror films get to do that.
Yeah.
A really good, even, I don't know, Insidious or whatever. You know, solid film. Most horror film fans saw it. Most people, even if it was rubbish, it's scary, you jump on whatever.
Yeah.
Or, but it's not somehow part of our popular culture.
No.
The way the really great ones are.
The one hope. The only hope. The Exorcist.
So last but not least, and I've got to ask you, as somebody who's seen as many films, what is your favourite horror film, or what do you think is the most perfectly made horror film?
The thing is, it's been asked so often that I have an answer.
Yeah.
My favourite horror film is Let's Scare Jessica to Death.
Paramount Pictures presents Let's Scare Jessica to Death.
And partly it's a personal thing. It's the time I saw it, the effect it had on me. For a long time, it was a film. I'd seen it in the cinema, and I think it was on television once. And so it was a film that not many other, even horror fans, had seen. It was a sort of slightly legendary film. I actually revived it myself a couple of times at the Scala and the NFT show, and it always wins friends because it's such a creepy and surprising film. Now probably is sort of getting nearer being canon, but for a long time it was a sort of personal favourite because it was a weird little one that wasn't on anybody else's lists. But also, I mean, the classics. I'll say certainly Psycho, Halloween, Texas Chainsaw Massacre, Night of the Living Dead, Frankenstein, Peeping Tom, all those things. The thing about those is they are absolutely essential choices, and I could talk for hours about why they're big. But in many ways, horror isn't just about the tent poles. It's about Deathline. It's about the little films that people discover on their own. That they see late night on television and tell their friends about, or make little discoveries of, or rent by mistake, or watch on Netflix and go around and tell everybody you really should see this one. Because sometimes it's the effect that individual films can have on individuals is, it's always like, no matter how bad a joke is, the first time you hear it, it's funny, right? So if the first horror film you see is Friday the 13th Part 4, that's still gonna be the film where you were introduced to all these.
That's one of the better sequels. That one.
Where all those conventions. If that's the first time you saw them, they're gonna be with you. And I'm sure that there are probably kids around now whose first horror film is like Goosebumps.
Yeah, absolutely.
But there's a tendency among some to sneer at 15-rated horror films.
Right. Yes.
But I'm sort of, I think there are some really interesting films being done that legitimately earn those certificates. But also you go and watch something like Ouija or Wish Upon or Unfriended with a teenage audience. People who are new to this, for whom this is the first time they're hearing these stories, or the first time they've got a ghost or a psycho movie in which the characters are talking in their slang and listening to their music and wearing their fashions. The way for me, Halloween or Black Christmas or Friday the 13th were kind of about the kind of teenager I was. It's why, and I remember a really perceptive review of Prom Night, the first one, the Jamie Lee Curtis one, where a critic from another generation, and these were films that mostly were being written off by horror fans at the time. They liked Halloween, was generally liked, but there was a sort of sense that horror fans would prefer vampire movies or Night of the Living Dead or whatever. But anyway, there were all these slasher movies right there, and this guy in Prom Night wrote about Prom Night. He said, I recognise that these films are for kids today what I Was a Teenage Werewolf was for my generation.
Right, yeah.
And I recognise that, you know, Wish Upon or Annabelle
the
are for
Conjuring,
kids
all those.
today what Hammer films were for me. And it's important that people are able to see themselves in their horror films. And I get a bit impatient with the sort of proprietorial interest from people who just want horror films for them. Who want to keep them and keep them pure. It's almost like if you default from the template at all, you're a heretic. It's like if you make The Witch, you're a heretic and you should be burned. But I don't know what is the mainstream template they're all looking at. What is the film because in your mind you have a perfect horror film, an idea that a film that is absolutely square and central in genre. For me, it's probably Dracula, but I could easily say Dracula the Hammer film. Couldn't say Dracula the Frank Langella film, although I'm warming up to it a bit. But what is it for the kind of the horror fan today? What do they say? Is it, I don't know, Saw?
It's funny, isn't it? It seems to have gone away from that stuff now and now into this very much kind of supernatural PG-13 type stuff.
That's right, because those films, they're 10 years ago now.
And
actually, I mean, I will... I have lots of good things to say about the Saw and the Hostel films. I think that they are enormously... they're zeitgeist films. I think they say lots of really interesting things. They're well constructed, and I think they relate to their audience brilliantly.
It kind of almost felt like they replaced the slasher after the kind of Scream 90s movement of the slasher. And became...
I also like those films.
Me too.
Which a lot of horror fans despised. It's like, and it is that sort of thing. It's kind of like that guy shouting at Bob Dylan for going electric, isn't it?
Yes, exactly.
It's like shouting at Wes Craven for having jokes in his films.
He's sick for fuck's sake. You've seen one too many movies.
Now, Sid, don't you blame the movies. Movies don't create psychos. Movies make psychos more creative.
Well, Kim, I could have asked you questions for another 4 hours, but I won't. But thank you so much for joining us. And there we go, the legendary Kim Newman. I literally could have sat and chatted to him for about 5 more hours, I think.
I bet. I mean, he's just a fountain of knowledge.
He is. And he has, we went to his flat to record that interview, and he has the coolest flat. I mean, it's exactly where you'd imagine Kim Newman to live.
Is it a big Gothic castle?
The amount of stuff he has, the amount of books he has, the amount of kind of horror memorabilia he has. Again, I would have liked to have just walked around it and explored a bit more. Very, very cool.
Wow, well, I feel honoured to be following the legend that is Kim.
Okay, so let's have a little chat now about some of our personal favourites in the horror world. I mean, what if you had a favourite kind of category of horror, a favourite horror subgenre or whatever? What would it be? Do you think?
I think I'd probably go slasher.
Yeah,
because they're the most fun. But I'll take anything. As long as it puts me on edge. I'm in.
Yeah.
How about you?
I used to be slasher 100%. As a teenager, I wanted to watch every single slasher film available. I wanted to watch every single Nightmare on Elm Street, Friday the 13th, and again, I think that stemmed from Scream and all that stuff. I think now I've become like a little bit more, I don't want to say refined, because I don't want to put down slashers, but I think maybe I'm just more of a wuss, or I'm more squeamish, but I like stuff that relies more on mood than gore. Like I'm quite a big fan of kind of ghost ones. Ones that are done well, not so much ones like Annabelle, but ones like the changeling and the innocence and that kind of thing. I'm all about kind of mood and sort of dread and that kind of thing now.
Yeah, I think growing up in the 90s, it was hard to escape the slashers.
Yes.
And watching pretty teens get killed off one by one.
Yeah.
So, that's it's ingrained.
Yeah.
But then I'm sure you'll probably ask me what my favourite horror film is. And then I'd probably say Let the Right One In.
Ooh,
now, it's my favourite film, full stop.
Yeah.
Whether you would call it a horror, again, is up for debate. But the mood, it's just I'm constantly on edge. I don't know what's going to happen. It's just beautiful.
Yeah.
And it deals with vampires, which, if you ask anybody else, vampires are horror.
Yeah.
And so you talk about dread and tension. I think I'm definitely going that way, for sure. But there's still room in my heart for a slasher, a good slasher.
When it's done well, there's something about it. Especially, I think slasher is something you have to watch amongst other people.
Yes.
There are some horror films that you'd rather watch by yourself and some that you'd rather watch in an audience as well.
I completely agree. Most horror films, I prefer to lock myself in my room in the dark and watch it alone. I once sat with a group of fellow film fans one Halloween watching I think three or four horror films back to back.
Yeah.
And I don't think any of us found any of them scary. And that was pretty much because we were a group. We were all sort of aware of what was about to happen, even if we hadn't seen it, and we make each other laugh.
Yeah.
I think there's a film, The Strangers, which may come up on this podcast at some point, which for all intents and purposes is pretty scary.
Yeah.
But no, not for me. That night completely ruined it.
No, that's definitely one you'd watch on your own. And actually, if you watch it on your own at home, especially those kind of home invasion ones,
of course.
Oh my God, it's like one of the most scary things I've sat through by myself. I watched The Strangers by myself. And I couldn't imagine sat round sort of drinking beer and watching that with mates.
No.
But, there are obviously those types of movies that are perfect for that. And, we've been to Fright Fest. We've done the whole of Fright Fest together. And that's definitely... you want movies like the slashers for that kind of a festival, don't you? I think you want that kind of crowd mentality where you can all kind of whoop and cheer at, somebody getting their head lopped off or something like that.
Yeah.
That's the thing. It's interesting because we were a little bit young for the whole Blair Witch Project phenomenon. I mean, I remember when it was out, I was about 12, 13. And I'm kind of glad that the first time I watched it was at home on video and not in the cinema, because I feel like those kind of grainy found footage movies, I think you want to watch them like you're watching a TV documentary as opposed to you're watching a big cinematic experience amongst a group of people. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, absolutely. Especially one that's shot on a video camcorder.
Yeah.
That looks like a home movie.
Yeah.
You want to be at home on your own.
Yeah.
Although, having said that, I saw Paranormal Activity at the cinema, surrounded by your typical popcorn crowd, and I loved it.
Yeah.
I think I blocked out all the laughs and all the jumps, and I was just in it.
Yeah.
But my friend who I was with hated it just from being in that kind of crowd mentality.
That's really interesting. Yeah. And actually, Kim Newman was just saying that about Paranormal Activity. That is one that it has a crowd mentality as well. I think it kind of feed off other people's tension.
Yeah, everybody sat there waiting for the next thing to go bump.
Yeah, and it's brilliant. Like, I do think the first Paranormal Activity was a clever idea because you just sat there watching an empty room for about 5 minutes, and people, I remember in this showing I was at, people start laughing because it's nervous laughter because you're like, what's going to happen? And then a door will move an inch and everyone screams, And I think if a film has the power to make you scream from that's pretty impressive. They're doing something right, aren't they?
Yep, absolutely.
But yeah, I think definitely when it comes to watching horror films, my preference is to be sat on my own at home with all the lights out, and that tends to be where I get the most scared.
Well, in the last few weeks, I've done that 3 or 4 times, and even the not so great ones made me turn my lamp on for at least 15 minutes before I went to bed.
Yeah.
It's the perfect environment.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, you were saying, was it Lights Out that you watched?
Lights Out, oh my God.
That is a lot better than it kind of had any right to be, that movie, I think.
For sure. It's such a simple premise.
Yeah. It's mental, isn't it? It's it's like, how did nobody think of this premise like 100 years ago? It feels like, how has this not been done before now? It was a really interesting, clever idea. I think in terms of my favourite horror movie, it's a tricky one because I've got horror movies that I enjoy watching and would watch over and over again. But I think in terms of what I think is pretty much a perfect horror movie, I said this to Kim Newman, is the Texas Chainsaw Massacre.
Okay,
Just because I think there's something so like palpable and horrible and just uncomfortable about
it's so
it from
sweaty and
yeah,
grisly.
You can almost smell that film, can't you?
Oof.
You know, it was one of those movies where, and a lot of people have had this, I think, when you watch these like notorious movies that you hear have been banned or, you know, whatever, and I think you're kind of always on edge from the second you start watching it because it's notorious or infamous or whatever. And I think I had that with Texas Chainsaw. I'd heard all this stuff about it, and even the title, you know, like we discussed with Kim, the title is scary enough, and you're expecting to see something so extreme, and actually it's not that extreme, but the way it's filmed makes you think you're watching something
For
extreme.
sure. Yeah, I rewatched it again this week actually, and you think after all this time it will have lost some of its edge, but it absolutely hasn't.
No.
Like, I think I watched it after numerous other 90s horror films, and it just beats them all hands down.
Thrashes them, absolutely. And it's everything. It's the way it's shot, it's the way the sound design works, it's the it's kind of scuzzy and horrible but brilliant. I just think it's, and the older I've gotten, the more I've grown to appreciate that and think it's pretty much a masterpiece, I think, in a weird way, you know. But having said that, I haven't watched it many times, and it is like a nightmare, and I just want it to end, you know. By the time the third act comes along and she's just running, screaming repeatedly and keeps running and ending up in the same place or ending up getting captured again and again, you just want it to be over, you know. And so I wouldn't say I sit and watch that for fun very much. And in terms of other favourites, it would maybe be The Shining, which is pretty much most people's favourite.
Yeah.
And recent ones, I love The Descent, I think.
The Descent is up there. Descent and Martyrs for me in recent horrors.
Yeah.
Especially horrors that I may not watch ever again.
Yeah, Martyrs is also, I'd categorise that alongside Texas Chainsaw as pretty much perfect. Never going to sit through that again. Absolutely horrible. I watched that on my own at home and remembered not being just scared, but being actually upset by it.
Yes,
like, genuinely upset by it.
I think I watched it one Christmas on my own. I had a nice pint of cider with me, which I don't usually do when I watch a horror film, and I couldn't drink it. I felt sick, physically sick, which never usually happens watching horror films. And yeah, that feeling, I don't want to feel that ever again.
No, absolutely not. So we've touched briefly on this just now, really. But what would you say then is your scariest movie? Not necessarily favourite, but scariest movie, or the most scared you've ever been watching a movie?
Well, it's hard. It's very hard, especially when I watched a lot of the classics in the past and trying to remember those exact sort of emotions and feelings.
Yeah.
But the ones that stick with me are, like you said, The Descent. It's so claustrophobic, which is a big thing for me. Claustrophobia is horrible. I don't get claustrophobic in real life.
Yeah.
But films that do, they make you feel that. And a great monster, obviously.
Yeah.
Or Wreck. Wreck is utterly
God.
terrifying.
Yeah.
There have been so many found footage films, but that one, and even its sequel, are terrifying, you know.
Absolutely. Of course, yeah. I won't ever forget that final act of Wreck. You know, when she goes up to the attic, it's really something. Yeah,
because you don't even see the monster until that sort of last second. And that, I think maybe that's one of the best endings to a horror film, because it really leaves you just completely out of breath and
wrung out. Yeah, it's amazing. And actually, that Blair Witch sequel really ripped a bit of that off, I thought, didn't
Absolutely.
it?
I mean,
the end.
they designed a witch to look almost exactly like.
Yeah. I was really disappointed with that Blair Witch film, but anyway, let's not get into that.
How about you then?
Scariest movie? I think I remember. I mean, I think it would be The Shining. I think that was the only movie I can remember, because, as I say, you know, I got really into all these kind of fun horror movies when I was a kid, when I watched Scream, and then I started watching the slashers. Way too young, really, to be watching all these slashers. But it didn't matter, because, to be honest, they weren't that scary. They're more fun.
Yeah.
And then I watched The Shining, and I was suddenly like, oh, this is what a proper scary movie is. And it got to the moment when, you know, he sees those two little girls dead in the corridor riding around his trike, and I turned it off. And I 12-year-old me was like, nope, this is too much. And I was so freaked out that I had to turn it off. And I think I watched an episode of South Park to calm myself down.
Yeah, I can imagine. I mean, watching South Park at 12 is probably... we were all doing it, but we probably shouldn't have.
And they were the golden days of South Park as well.
But masterfully made, just visually stunning.
Yeah.
Like, if you were going to watch a horror film at 12 years old...
Yeah.
that's going to tell you all you need to know.
Yeah, but it's almost too much at 12 years old. It's almost too much because you don't quite understand what's happening, and it's so horrible. And again, like we said about Texas Chainsaw, where there's this like palpable sense of fear. The Shining has that in a different kind of way. It has it in a different, like, everything. Just glancing down corridors is terrifying, and glancing at elevator doors and moving cameras going around, roaming around hallways and stuff. It's just everything manages to be scary in that, which is amazing. I don't really know how directors pull that off, where the most mundane things are somehow scary. But
no, there's that whole feeling of just tension and eeriness. To build that is what makes a good horror film, and that's why so many of the cheap ones are just in it for the money. They're not thinking as creatively, and you just lose it completely.
Totally. What about, like, if you look back at old, because we talked about a lot of modern ones, but like, do you think that there's still any merit in rewatching like the classic Universal movies from the 30s, or the Thing from Another World in the 50s, or all these types of movies, like, other than people like us maybe that like to look back at it from a historical perspective? Do you think there's much more to gain from those movies?
I was going to answer that question with exactly what you just said. Obviously, looking forward from them is a fascinating thing in the development of the genre, but I don't know. If all you want to do is be scared, there's not much to scare me in those films.
No.
Obviously, back in the day when there hadn't been anything like it, maybe. And even modern updates of those classic stories, just not that scary. I wrote my dissertation on Gothic literature.
Oh, cool.
So I'm really into the Gothic world. But I just can't bring myself to rewatch those, the classic Universal ones. Oh, God, they're bringing them back, and no one needs that. But
I know. Yeah, it's a weird thing with those old films. I rewatched Frankenstein recently, and there were things of it that I do think are, like, really impressive, just filmmaking for its age. You kind of think, wow, this is incredible. But yeah, I don't think I would necessarily recommend them to my friends who aren't as nerdy as I am. That's the thing, that are just going to want to go and watch The Conjuring rather than
if you want a jump scare, that's not what it's about. There's lots to talk about in terms of filmmaking.
Having said that, one of my favourite ever movies that I still love is The Night of the Hunter. I don't know if you've ever seen.
I haven't seen that.
Oh my God, you just have to watch The Night of the Hunter. It's pretty much perfect, and it isn't really that dated, even though it's made in the mid-50s, because it's shot and lit so beautifully, and it's quite low-key. It's not relying on special effects or jump scares or anything that might make it dated. It's much more human, about this, basically a psychopath pursuing these kids through a night, and it's really scary and really surreal as well. And it's apparently allegedly one of David Lynch's favourite movies, and you can tell because it has these kind of dreamlike sequences as well. But you should definitely check that out.
Certainly shall.
And there's definitely some like old gems that do stand the test of time, but I think the majority are.
It goes back to what you were saying at the start about creating a mood, and a tension, and that if you can get that right, you don't need to rely on a monster or special effects. And that's not going to date, because a scary mood is going to be a scary mood. Whereas a man in makeup, not necessarily gonna do the same thing.
Exactly. It's interesting. And like, obviously me and Kim discussed, can horror movies go too far, and we touched briefly upon things like a Serbian film or Human Centipede and that kind of thing. What are your opinions on those types of movies?
Well, having watched The Human Centipede at university, I thought, it's that classic. Horror moved into a period where it just wanted to be gore for gore's sake, or horrible ideas for the sake of it. And actually, The Human Centipede was a pretty poor mad scientist movie with a central conceit that was pretty gross. But beyond that, it wasn't a particularly scary film.
No.
And it wasn't that well made. I liked that it was horrible, like the central conceit. But beyond that,
there's not much.
Not much to recommend it. A Serbian film I've still not watched because it just sounds
just so grim.
Grim for the sake of being grim.
I think that's
it.
I'm
not necessarily interested in seeing gross things because they're gross.
No.
As maybe I would have been in my teens when when those websites all popped up with murder scene photos and things. Like, what's that going to be like? oh, that's horrible.
Yeah.
Maybe I'll never look at that
I wish
ever
I
again.
hadn't looked at that. Yeah, exactly. And again, those types of movies, if you're not going to watch them for a laugh with your mates, what's the point? I mean, who would sit down on their own and pop on Human Centipede or a Serbian film?
Well, I did do that with all 3 Human Centipedes, only because I couldn't find anyone else to watch them with me, and I hated them all. Well, first one I thought was rubbish. The other 2 I hated.
I didn't get beyond part 2 because part 2 was so horrible. I haven't watched part 3, but it's
not as horrible. It's actually just mostly boring.
Naff. Yeah.
It tries to be self-referential. Well, it is self-referential. Tom Six is in it as himself.
Yes.
And it's just a mess, and it's not. And those films you'd want to watch if you're going to watch them for the big gross out moment.
Yeah.
And it does not deliver in any way. You know, you get 3 people in the first film, you get something like 6 or 7 in the second film, and then the last film sells itself as being 100 prisoners or something, and then you get 1 shot.
Yeah,
you're like, you want to see that feces pass through everybody? If you're gonna do it,
might as well go for it.
Yeah, nah.
Yeah, that's the thing. It feels like it was an idea or a poster before it was a story, you know?
Sure.
Like Snakes on a Plane, or, you know, it was like someone came up with this like 1-sentence premise of the Human Centipede, but then had to stretch it out, not just to a 90-minute movie, but to 3 movies for some reason.
Yeah.
It's mental.
Because obviously we went through the torture porn phase, which started with some decent films that weren't all about the gore.
Yeah.
And then we got the gore in the wave of sequels and stuff. And there were some decent films along the way, but mostly, you know...
There's some good French ones that we've already mentioned.
Absolutely,
you know, they're definitely the high point. And now we're kind of into the very much like sort of PG-13 sort of phase, aren't we? I think it's gone... The pendulum has swung back the other way, and we're all about James Wan and, you know, all of those movies. Yeah, jumps, basically. I think Nigel Floyd calls it cattle prod cinema, where you feel like you're being, electrocuted every few minutes, which I completely agree with.
Yeah, and it has its place. I'm happy to be jump scared out of my skin, as long as it doesn't take 2.5 hours to happen.
Exactly. Yeah, and actually, the latest Conjuring, the Conjuring 2 was, I think, 2 hours and 20 minutes, and that's just too much. Too much for what is essentially a ghost train ride, really. But I thought it was funny how Kim mentioned the one movie that he couldn't bear to watch a second time was Eraserhead, David Lynch's Eraserhead, because that's such a different type of movie to any of the ones we've
I don't know if I would call that a horror film. It's
certainly horrible.
It's all about mood, and it's suffocating and just nasty,
unpleasant.
But is it scary?
I mean,
I don't know if it's scary.
David Lynch is an interesting one, isn't it? I mean,
we both love David Lynch. We must say this.
We've got to. I couldn't not mention David Lynch, but his films are fascinating because I don't know if you'd ever call any of them horror movies necessarily, but they're all terrifying in their own way.
Yeah.
And again, it basically goes back a little bit on our argument then about what is a horror movie, because his movies are scary, I would say, for the most part.
Well, they can be.
Yeah, or at least they have scary moments.
They have scary moments, and they certainly take elements of the genre.
Yeah.
Does that make... If you have elements of horror, does that make it a horror?
I think, you know, Fire Walk With Me is pretty much a horror, I would say. On Lost Highway, but who knows? But Eraserhead is one of those. It's more like it's just an attack on all your senses, isn't it?
Of course,
it's like going to watch a Lars von Trier movie as well. It's that same kind of a thing. They're not horror filmmakers necessarily, but they do make you feel like quite grossed out, quite uncomfortable, quite unpleasant. You know, it's an interesting one. Okay, so we've talked about our favourites, about our scariest. What about the most overrated? I mean, I won't just say what's the worst horror movie, because there are so many bad ones.
There are many bad horror films.
I love horror films more than anything, but there are so many bad ones. But what about the most overrated horror movie then? So one that maybe is hailed by many as a masterpiece, which you just didn't get.
Yeah, okay. So you go through the classics, and I think I agree that most classic horror films are up there. For sure. I suppose I had to look more recently at films that people have loved.
Yes.
And found really scary. And I was just sat there like, I don't understand it. And for me,
please don't say The Witch.
I'm not going to say The Witch. Don't you worry. I won't go there with you, Mike.
Yeah.
The Woman in Black.
Oh.
Now, maybe it's because I've seen too many horror films.
Yeah.
And it just does the things that everything has done in the past. But I was not scared. My housemate was shitting himself when he saw it. I've spoken to many other people who claim it's the best horror film of the last 10 years. And I did not see it.
No, it's certainly not that. And Daniel Radcliffe ruined it a bit for me.
I'm not a fan of Daniel Radcliffe.
No.
I just watched all the Harry Potter films for the first time. And he gets better as an actor, but he's not a great actor.
He's a really lovely guy, and good for him that he's had such a good career.
Yeah.
But also, he was, I just think, very miscast in Woman in Black, because he's meant to be this like guy with 2 kids. And,
yeah, he still looks like a child.
He's still Harry Potter. So yeah, I can't agree with you there, because I was terrified by the Woman in Black.
Oh, wow.
I wasn't expecting to be. I was very sniffy about it. I was like, oh, what's this? It's Daniel Radcliffe. It's a 12A. I'm not going to blah, blah, blah. Put it on and shat myself. Absolutely shat myself. I've never watched it a second time, to be fair. And I don't think it was... I think it was one of those movies, like we talked about, the kind of cattle prod ones, that I think it scared me because it made me jump more than anything else. More than the filmmaking was brilliant. But...
I mean, to commend it, it actually had a story.
Yeah.
It was a proper ghost story.
Yeah.
Albeit one that ripped off a million other ghost stories,
Yeah.
but I just was not scared once.
Yeah. I don't know what I would call the most overrated. I mean, maybe...
Go on, be controversial.
Alan Jones would be quite upset with me for this. Maybe Suspiria.
Oh.
And I think in general, those kind of Dario Argento films...
Giallo
the sort of Giallo movies, which we're going to get into in the next few weeks, but... I just don't get it with those films. I know that they are shot and lit beautifully.
I mean, they look like amazing films.
Yes.
Yeah.
That is it, though, really. That is it. There's something... I can't get on board with them. Maybe it was a thing you had to be there for. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, they clearly have their place among the horror pantheon and as influences, and stylistically they're brilliant.
Yeah.
But I agree. I mean, I can't confess to be some sort of expert on the genre.
No, me neither.
The ones I have seen... Yeah. Mostly distracted by the dubbing.
Oh, yeah, the dubbing. Yeah, exactly. So, yeah, that's and I keep thinking maybe I just need to broaden my knowledge of them. Maybe I need to watch more and I'll get it. But every time I go to put one on, I just think, oh, here we go. Yeah. What's the running time of this one? Yeah.
I have to say though, I did watch Deep Red. Profondo Rosso in advance of this podcast, and I thought, right, this is going to be the one. And then I press play, and I immediately got that feeling of, oh god.
And that is over 2 hours long.
But it is actually all right.
Yeah.
I found myself scared at points. It's quite creepy. Obviously, it looks amazing, and it's got some clever stuff in it.
Yes.
You know, precursors to death are always interesting.
Yes.
But yeah, that's the only one I've actually enjoyed.
And I do love the goblin music as well.
Oh wow, setting a sort of precedent for different style of music over a horror film. Yeah.
And that's the thing about those films that frustrates me even more, I think, because I love everything on a superficial level. I love everything about those movies. I love the music, the cinematography, the lighting, the production design. I just wish that I could get into the film more. Yeah. But yeah, it's something... There's a kind of barrier there for some reason. Okay, so finally then, the last thing I think I should talk about, and again, I mentioned this briefly with Kim Newman, but why do you think horror has the reputation of being one of the lowest art forms, I suppose, when it comes to movie genres?
Yeah, that's hard. Maybe because it is a sort of select audience who like to be scared.
Yeah.
I know many of my friends wouldn't sit through a horror film.
Yeah.
Which is why you and I were the only ones to attend Fright Fest together last year. So there's that, but also maybe thinking like kind of critically, horror films became huge because they were made on such a low budget.
Yes.
And they don't, especially the early 80s when it kicked off,
yeah.
they were made so cheaply and looked pretty rough and ready
yeah.
that they immediately gained a reputation as not being filmic films particularly. So maybe it started there.
I guess also there's just so many bad ones and there are so many good ones, but because it's such a cheap format to make, any filmmaker thinks that they can make a horror film and not many people actually can do it well. That's the thing.
But that's the thing. And also you make a low budget horror film, that's really great.
Yeah.
But unless you've got the budget to make it look good, it's not always going to work.
It's not. And unless you've got an idea to go with that. Okay, so the people that made the Blair Witch Project had no money, but they used the idea to make that work, you know, and if you've not got a good idea, a good story, a good like premise, I think it can be quite simple a lot of the time as well to work, you know. But yeah, you know, I think there's so many key kind of horror movies throughout history that then start a trend, and then from that one brilliant one you have 100 crap imitators.
Yeah.
And then everything kind of gets drowned in this awash in a sea of bad horror movies, you know.
Absolutely. And there's no other genre that really does that.
No.
Like, you wouldn't see a comedy and then see 1,000 comedies that look exactly like it.
Yes.
You might get rom-com, like a flourish of rom-coms.
Yeah.
But they're not all exactly the same.
No.
And, I guess rom-com is a genre that gets treated badly as well.
Yes, exactly. And actually comedy in general.
Yeah.
But
I think that's probably it, is that at one point there was a good one.
Yeah.
But then there were 1,000 other bad ones.
Yeah.
And that's the reputation that holds.
Yeah, I think it's true. And I think like comedy, I think both of them are really unfairly kind of reviled, and because actually good horror is hard to get right and comedy is hard to get right, and so therefore you get a lot of bad comedies and a lot of bad horror movies out there, and so a lot of people just think it's probably going to be shit, I probably won't bother seeing it or whatever, when actually there's some, some of the best horror movies are some of the best movies of all time, which we've already discussed.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Well, there you go. I think that's pretty much all there is to discuss for now, for this week at least, as a kind of introduction to the podcast, as a kind of broad overview of the horror genre. But before we go, we would really, really love to hear from you guys. Please do drop us an email or a tweet for next time. It'd be great to hear some of your stories, some of your anecdotes, some of your point of view of what we've discussed today. So, what was the very first horror movie you ever saw? What's the scariest movie you've ever seen? What movie scared you as a child, but what movie still scares you today? What's your favourite horror movie? What's your kind of hidden gem? What's the worst or most overrated horror movie for you? We are planning on some point towards the end, maybe towards Christmas, to do a big kind of feedback review episode where we do read out everyone's emails and we respond to sort of listener feedback. So please do get in touch. The email address is evolutionofhorror@gmail.com, or you can tweet us at evolutionpod. So basically from next week onwards, we're going to be delving into the history of the slasher movie. So this is where we're going to start. And we're going to be looking at slashers from sort of their early origins all the way through to sort of where slashers are at now, and if they kind of
are they around now? Yeah,
it's an interesting thing. So that's what we're going to delve into over the next sort of 8 to 10 weeks, basically. So hopefully you're going to come with us and enjoy us on this journey. So I'm going to have a different person joining me each week for each different episode. And next time, I'm actually going to be joined by 3 different people. We're going to have a kind of brief history of the slasher genre with Michael Blythe from the BFI. I'm then going to be delving into feminism and misogyny within the slasher genre and talking about that with Olivia and Anna, who are also known as the Final Girls, and they curate female-driven horror movies and genre movies. So really looking forward to discussing that with them. So Rob, thank you so much
for
joining me this week, and I will see you again very, very soon in a few weeks' time.
Fantastic.
Where can people find you in the world, Rob?
Well, Twitter.
Yes.
At RobWatts88.
Good.
That's where I am, and I have a blog, which is Outside of a Dream, from David Lynch's Mulholland Drive.
Nice.
Outsideofadream.wordpress.com. That's me. Amateur film blogger, horror lover.
And you can find me on Twitter as well. I am at The Movie Mike. And I also do another podcast, just more of a general film, movie, sort of new release podcast with Rihanna Dillon. And that is called Back Row. So you can subscribe to Back Row Podcast on iTunes. And you can also find Back Row on Twitter at Back Row Films. And don't forget, if you liked episode 1, please do subscribe to us on iTunes. Then you'll get updated with each new episode as it comes. And if you do get a spare couple of minutes, we would really, really, really appreciate it if you could just drop a little rating or review on iTunes. It will help this podcast get a bit of a boost. It will help it be discovered more by other people. It kind of goes up the list on iTunes. I don't quite get how these algorithms work, but essentially the more feedback you get, the better. So please do drop us a review if you get time. Thank you so much for listening. Join us again next week for the evolution of horror.